Modern paints are radically different from traditional artist paints, made for centuries from plant oils mixed with coarsely ground coloured pigments. The biggest change over the last 50 years has been the development of a huge range of synthetic paints. Some were intended specifically for artists' use, most famously fast-drying acrylic paints. But artists also soon began to use others developed for industrial use, such as house paints and car paints. Artists can use these modern paints to make almost every conceivable variation of colour, transparency, gloss, texture and consistency. They can also be applied in new ways, rollered, sprayed, dripped and flicked. Tate's conservation team are constantly developing new expertise in how to study and care for modern paintings, which often use synthetic paints alongside traditional oils. And in this sound tour, they're going to look in detail at 10 key modern paintings here at Tate Modern, made between the 1920s and just a few years ago. The Mexican artist David Siqueiros was a radical Marxist who believed that modern art should use modern materials. This picture is painted with car paint. It was created at the experimental workshop that Siqueiros ran in New York in 1936, where groups of artists, including a young Jackson Pollock, worked together to learn new techniques. Tate conservator Patricia Smithen.
The paint they used was a nitrocellulose-based paint, also known as pyroxylin, and it was a material that was developed in the 1920s specifically to use for cars and other machinery. It's very, very fast drying. It's a very glossy surface at the end. And the reason why this paint was allowed to be developed is also because around 1907 was the introduction of the air spray gun, which allows a very fast, even application. And this nitrocellulose paint, when it was first introduced, incredibly speeded up times of manufacture. It allowed a car to dry in 30 minutes as opposed to several days. So the whole idea behind the experimental workshop was that you would experiment with the paint, you would understand its flow properties, its viscosity, the way it handled in all different situations. And once you got a real grasp of the material, you would then be able to manipulate it to suit your artistic purposes. This painting is a really good example of the experiments that they did with the paint. In the background, you can see it's rather glossy, and it gets more rough and ready and more textured towards the front of the painting, particularly in the middle ground where you see the lovely sand rock texture. Siqueiros added these materials to his paint in order to counteract the glossy smoothness of the enamel surface. One of the other techniques he would do is lie the board flat on the ground, apply a couple of layers of paint, and then pour some solvent on top of that. As the solvent dissolved into the paint, it swirls around, mixing the colors and creating these lovely effects, almost like petrol on water. And you see that on the left-hand side of the painting in the lovely swirly bit in the middle ground. In the foreground of the paint, we've got these beige triangles, and they were actually created using a stencil. He applied the stencil over the paint surface and then used the air spray gun and sprayed the thin paint over the stencil in various areas. You can also see, if you look a little bit more closely at the surface, you can see the drip technique, particularly in the lovely red flame in the center of the painting. That is obviously a bit of paint that was just swirled and dropped very delicately, probably from a stick or something. We don't really know how Siqueiros approached his paintings. We don't know if he had a subject matter in mind and created the painting to fulfill the subject matter. In this case, we think that he experimented with the paint and he created these effects. And I think he probably saw the subject matter of war and violence in the effects that he created. So while he was using these artistic techniques, he was actually using them to fulfill his political purpose.
In Night Vision, Fiona Rae used artist's oil paint and fast-drying acrylic paint. Here she is in conversation with Tate's conservation scientist, Tom Lerner, about how she worked with the paints.
The ground colour on this painting is acrylic, the background black colour, which I actually don't call the background because I like the idea of it not necessarily being in the background, but something that might float forward to interfere with the things on the front of the painting. So I used acrylic for that by rollering it on with small, fluffy rollers. And it's a paint that was invented to look flat and a bit dead, really, a bit machine-made. And I wanted it to contrast with the oil paint, which I use for everything else. The other good thing about acrylic is that it's incredibly flexible, and you can really give it quite a lot of abuse with brushes and palette knives, and it won't crack, and you can even repair bits if you need to, kind of wipe it down and repaint it. Then I used oil for the other bits, because oil paint has a different kind of flexibility in that you can do all kinds of things with it, like stretch it, fluff it, make it go super thick, super glossy. It has a luminescence that acrylic doesn't really have. Oil kind of glows from the inside. So I wanted to contrast those two things in this painting. The first thing I did with the oil paint was to make these coloured rectangles with borders around them, and I did that with masking tape and a ruler and a flat brush to put the oil paint on just thinly and as smoothly as I could by hand. I wanted it to look a bit machine-made, a bit artificial. The other thing I did with the black and white brush marks that I masked out was do a couple of horizontal ones, and one of them in particular has a little kind of kink in the end, as if the system had gone wrong. So there's a sort of kink in one of the rectangles that then relates to all the more organic brushwork, which you see in the rest of the painting, where the colour comes in, and some of the black and white brush marks then join in with this kind of flesh-eating torture, Francis Bacon, Night of the Dark Spirit stuff.
And then this incredible multicoloured area roughly in the centre of the painting with this bright red and the yellows and the browns and the turquoise. Could you just tell me a bit about how that was applied?
I took quite a big brush, I guess around 6 inches wide, and I mixed the oil paint so it's a bit like cream, like double cream, not quite single cream so it just drips off the brush, but something that'll stay on the brush, a bit like ice cream. So I built up this kind of ice cream amount of paint. And then because those are sort of fairly cheerful colours, the turquoise and the yellow and the pale pink, I chose a translucent brown to then lie on top of it on the brush. And then as I applied it, the brown kind of stretched and opened and revealed some of the colours underneath as the mark went on. So it was I had to be a bit sort of zen and careful how I did it. And I often just remove the bits I don't like and turn them into something else so that it can look as if I knew exactly what I wanted and was able to achieve it immediately, whereas the whole thing often goes to plan B or plan C and another brush mark then comes in.
I know in some of your paintings you said you've had different orientations so that it hasn't always been painted upright, maybe on its side. Did you do that with this painting? Yes,
this painting I definitely turned all different ways up as I was painting it. I don't like to set up a completely obvious expectation of in which direction things were all moving. Even to do with my height, I might get on a ladder or kind of crouch down very low. So you can see there's some horizontal pale turquoise strips flying off to the left, so which would have meant, I guess, that I painted that bit of it on its side.
And then the sides of the painting, which you can see very clearly, actually, if you move to the edge of the painting.
Yeah, I paint the edges of the painting with the ground colour, the black, and then where the rectangles hit the edge, I follow them round just very slightly, because I like the idea that if you're coming into the room from a 30-degree angle, you're not faced with the complete artifice and grubbiness of a stretcher with a bit of old white canvas on the side, that you're already starting to enter into the picture place, the picture space, like a reward from coming in at the side.
Tate conservator Annette King on the two different lives of this picture, The Fig Leaf, by Francis Picabia.
It was painted, first of all, in 1921, and if you look very carefully at the surface of the painting, you can see that there's a different image beneath the one that you see now. At the top of the painting, you can see two circles, a smaller one within a larger one. From the base of the circle, a line comes down through the figure's raised ankle, and there's another small circle which has a sort of fan belt around it. And then it comes down to the lower left corner, and if you look very carefully from the side, you might be able to see a large hand holding the line as if it was drawing. This painting was called Les Yeux Chauds, or Hot Eyes, and was a critique of the art establishment in 1921. It was inscribed with the words, "Homage to Franz Jourdain, who was the president of the Autumn Salon, thanks to the Autumn Salon," rather ironically, and with a touch of farce, he wrote, "The onion has the force." There are only black and white photographs of the original painting, so one of the surprising things we discovered in examining this painting is that actually it was probably very brightly coloured. If you look at the left-hand edge just inside the frame, you can see traces of turquoise paint. The hand can be seen in X-ray, but also there's a tiny loss in the black of the ball which shows it was a bright pink colour. In 1922, he painted over that first painting and we have the image that we see today. It was based on an artist called Ingres, who painted a painting of Oedipus and the Sphinx in 1808. Picabia takes the image of Oedipus leaning on a boulder, but subverts it. So instead of having the left leg of the figure on the boulder, he puts the right leg up. And save for the fig leaf, that would have meant his genitals would have been on show. The technique of the painting is very interesting. Surprisingly, when Picabia redesigned the painting, instead of painting it all white first and then painting the figure on top, it seems he painted the figure first in the black paint. The white background was then painted up to and around the whole of the figure, the ball, and the black line at the base. When that was dry, Picabia painted the lettering. He then added another white layer, which he then carefully painted all around the letters as well. And there are places you can see the white slightly overlaps the black, but generally it's done with very great care. At some point after this stage, the painting has got very badly damaged. And if you look at the lower half of the painting, you can see two large areas of tears. And Picabia, instead of having these repaired, just decided to paint over them, again with a layer of white. So this painting is really a series of layers of Picabia's work. It's a very interesting look back on various areas of his life and the way that he carried the painting through with him in his career.
Tom Lerner, conservation scientist at Tate, on Incubus by Gary Hume, painted entirely in gloss house paint.
It's intended to look like doors, hospital doors, but in fact the support, the material that the paint is actually applied to, were custom made for Hume and consist of a sheet of aluminium honeycomb onto which a piece of formica was glued so that the glossy, shiny surface is actually stuck onto the aluminium. So the actual surface that's being painted on is the reverse side of a sheet of formica. It's a much rougher consistency and provides a decent key or tooth for the paint to stick to. The actual image of the doors was created with other household materials. Strips of masking tape were first applied to the panels, followed by draft excluder. The paint was then applied right up to the edge of these materials, and once the paint had dried, the draft excluder was peeled back, and there we have the ridges that were left. The kinds of house paints that Hume is regularly using are the typical house paints that you would buy in any hardware shop. So he has used Dulux, Crown, Bromell, but in fact for this painting and the paintings that went with it, painted in America, Hume recalls finding it very difficult to find high-gloss house paints. He did find a Dutch paint, which he says the gloss is not as high as normal gloss paints, but gives this very nice sheen. The paint was brushed onto these panels, never poured. The panels were laid flat, supported by paint pots at each corner. And if you crouch down, you can quite clearly see the brush strokes and the direction that the paint was applied.
The snail is a paper cutout made by Matisse towards the end of his life. There are 22 different paper pieces here, all brightly coloured with watery gouache paint. Matisse called works like these cutouts rather than collages because the act of cutting the paper itself was such an important part of the design. Tate conservator Rosie Fremantle.
The cutouts themselves are actually white paper that have been hand-painted by assistants, or, well, one story goes that they were actually house painters that Matisse employed to paint out different colours onto these large sheets of paper, which he then stockpiled in his studio. And you can see the streaks on the surface of the works, which became quite important to Matisse, especially in his later works, and actually sometimes dictated the direction in which he cut the sheets out. It also emphasised the handmade nature of the object, which of course he was keen to do. And you can see the roughness of the way that these works are constructed to a certain degree. There's stories about the way they were pinned to the wall in his studio and the breezes in the summer, coming through the windows in the studio, blowing these gently, and they'd rustle in the wind. There was a lot of moving about, repinning, and all the edges of the cutouts have got little tears and marks and scrapes and folds in some cases on the surface that are small mechanical damages, but they're just messages to show you how the works were made. I have a really strong image of Matisse. There are pictures of him sitting up in a chair or in bed cutting out his cutouts on a smaller scale, but he really used big scissors no matter what he was cutting. He didn't muck around with nail scissors or anything of that sort, but he called them cutting shears, and they really were like almost garden scissors. And I can imagine him chomping through these big pieces of paper. Apparently the thickness of this paper was important to him, the resistance that it gave while he was cutting it, so they're not lightweight papers by any means.
Summertime number 9A is one of Jackson Pollock's famous action paintings, in which he poured and flicked paint onto a large canvas on the floor. But what kind of paint? Stand anywhere along the length of this picture and take a closer look, and you'll see very different materials. Conservation scientist Tom Lerner.
The black and the silver grey paints we know from analysis are a form of house paint. They would have been extremely fluid, poured onto the canvas, probably with sticks or the handles of brushes, and compare that to the artist oil paint, the bright yellows, the two blues, the reds, the greens, the ochres, probably taken straight from the tube and applied in a traditional manner with a paintbrush. The house paints being used by Pollock here are all oil-based, very similar, in fact, to the sorts of paints being used to paint a door frame. There would have been a lot of organic solvent, probably turpentine, both from within the paint itself, and perhaps also Pollock would have diluted the paint down a bit further, so it would have been an extremely smelly process. In many areas, particularly the black and grey paints, you can see wrinkling in the surface. This is a common phenomenon in house paints when they are applied a little bit too thickly. A skin can form on the surface, and as the underlying parts dry, so wrinkling forms. You can also see quite clearly differences in the physical properties, in other words, how brittle the paints are. You can see distinct cracks, vertical and horizontal, in the black and grey areas, whereas the artist oil paint is still pretty flexible and no cracks are apparent there. The background of this painting, you can see, is the canvas. There is no pigmented priming or ground layer on top of it, although we have detected a transparent coating, an animal glue, very, very thin. If you look closely at some of the poured areas, perhaps in the black paint, you can see there are some extremely narrow bands of colour, and without that animal glue size, those thin lines would probably have bleeded out to a much wider appearance. Another big difference between the types of paint would be in the drying time. The first part of the painting would have been the canvas laid flat on the ground. The house paint was then poured and dripped, and then Pollock, after maybe a day or two, once that house paint had dried reasonably quickly, would have come back with these far more calculated, carefully placed areas of bright artist colour. So although this painting appears extremely spontaneous, I think the evidence from the different kinds of paints being used show that in fact there was a huge amount of planning that went into it.
These paintings are part of a series of huge canvases made by Mark Rothko in 1958 and 1959. They were originally commissioned for the upmarket Four Seasons restaurant of the Seagram Building in New York. In his studio, Rothko constructed stud walls covered in brown paper to recreate the dimensions of the restaurant space, and he let the paintings develop as he experimented with paint. Tate conservator Mary Buston.
He knew that he wanted to paint maroon paintings, so he decided to prime his canvases with a maroon priming made of rabbit skin glue and a red and a blue pigment to make the maroon. An assistant recalls making up huge batches of rabbit skin glue, heating it up in a pot, and then adding in powder pigments and stirring it up well so the paint was well mixed. And then the two of them had to work very fast, because if they waited and just made one area, let it dry, and then did an area next to it, you'd end up with a patchwork. They had one man up on top of the ladder, one man below, two of them with big brushes, and they would start and work furiously from one side to the other. And this stuff is very wet, so they get absolutely plastered with it. So they get covered in red paint from tip to toe. But at the end of it, they'd have one perfectly evenly primed red canvas. Rothko used a fairly traditional basis for his paintings. He used tube oil paints, artist oil paints, that he would squish out into tins, often old coffee tins, and then add a bit of turpentine so that it would be silky and softer. And you can see in this black painting, the middle of the wall on the left, with almost like a window form with two openings in it. If you look at the black paint and look carefully, you can see that Rothko's used a fairly thin paint and a large brush, and he's scuffed it on. He's scuffed it from side to side, flicked it a little bit so you can see feathered edges. The lines that he's making are not strong and heavily defined. They're sort of soft, and he's playing with the forms so that it looks like the black is blurring into the maroon on either side. But it looks more simple than it really is, because in fact he hasn't used just one black. He's waited until this black was dry, and then he's gone over the top of it with a bluer black and then a browner black. And the maroon too is not a simple maroon. He's added a bit more. He's stabbed it a little bit with the ends of the brush so that you can see in the top right corners a little bit more red, a little bit bluer maroon. And he's working quite fast too. If you look at the window openings, you can see black splashes, places where the paint is sort of flicked onto the surface. He doesn't seem to mind about that. He likes the fact that there's a little bit of accident in there. Rothko rather played with his paint, and if you look around the room, you can see ways in which he adapted his oil paint by adding extra things or by diluting it so much that, say, if you look at the painting on the right, the one with the red window and the white haze behind, the white haze has arrived because he diluted his paint so much that in fact became pale as it dried. That pale area there is in fact a very dark grey paint. It's just scattering the light so much that it looks like haze. That's part of the fun of these paintings. The longer you look at them, the more that things appear.
Picasso painted this picture in just a single day in April 1952. It was meant as a memorial to the Greek communist activist Nikos Belianis, who'd been executed 2 weeks before. Picasso took traditional elements from memento mori paintings, including the skull and the flickering candle, and used just black and white paint. Tate conservator Annette King.
Although it's black and white, there's quite a lot of thought and innovation gone into this painting. The black, we think, after analysis, is a house paint. You can tell it's a house paint because they use oil, which they would boil up to 240 centigrade, and then filter it. And then they would add materials to dry the oil and thicken it, things like chalk, talc, kaolin. And if you find these elements in a paint, it's quite often thought to be a house paint. And Picasso is thought to have always had a tin of black and white house paint in his studio and often used it on paintings, but it's quite difficult to identify without analysis. The whites on this painting are quite complicated. There's the thin lead white ground, and if you look at the lines of the bottle, you'll see some of the lead white ground showing through where Picasso hasn't put any paint on the ground. And then there are two different types of white paint. And if you look very closely at the surface textures, there are some that have stiff peaks, impasto, and this is thought to be a pigment called lithopone. And the reason it makes a stiff paint is because it absorbs lots of oil, and you can't actually get it to become runny. It just becomes a nice stiff paste. And Picasso has used this paint largely in the skull of the goat to create the raised impasto peaks. The other white paint he used has zinc in it and titanium, and this doesn't absorb as much oil and makes a smoother paste. And if you look at the diamond shape above the goat's skull, you can see these squiggles of rather free-flowing circular brushstrokes. He painted with probably quite thin brushes with this painting. He's also used different thicknesses of paint, as we know, but if you look at the blacks, there are also some very fluid lines. If you look at the loop to the right of the candle, it's always sort of dripping slightly. So although it's a grisaille, it's a very serious subject, he's used the textures and all the different paints. He was a master at knowing which paints to use to create which effects.
This tiny picture shows how Salvador Dali made very skilled use of traditional artists' materials, such as oil paint and resin, in this case on a smooth wooden panel. Tate conservator Patricia Smithen.
Dali thought he was a wonderful painter. He thought he was probably the best painter of his generation, and he wanted paintings that would survive the test of time. He really wanted the world to benefit. And in some sense, he actually deserves his self-congratulations. He was a wonderful technician, beautifully applied paint, really gorgeous. What he's done on this little painting is really typical of his work, and he did a whole series of these small panels. This one is on a mahogany panel, which was machined very smooth and flat, and then he applied the background paint. Essentially, what he's doing is creating a setting to place his figures in. And what he wanted was a very, very smooth finish. He said that you could not have a fine enough finish for these background surfaces, for the underpainting, as he called it. So once Dali set the stage by creating this background, this lovely beach scene at Rosas, what he does then is he lays in the figures. And in this case, we sort of have these four elements, and they're painted in different ways almost. We've got the figure group of the three erotic ballerinas in the front left corner. The source image for these is probably a postcard. The postcard's been lost, but Dali actually had a collection of postcards, and there are very similar images throughout this collection. And in this case, we think he's actually directly transferred the image from the postcard to the surface of the painting. When you look at the image under magnification, you can actually see the underdrawing. It's very granular, and you can see the outlines of these images, and they're very specific. Not only does he do the outlines of the dancers, a lot of the detail in the skirts is all outlined, very specific and obviously directly from a source. This is in real contrast to what's happening with the other figures. There's the figure in the center of the painting, which is supposed to be his cousin Carolinetta, and there's no underdrawing at all on this figure. For me, I think the difference is because the dancers are from a direct source, whereas the figure of his cousin is from his imagination. And what he's done is he's taken a very, very liquid paint with a very fine brush and laid the paint down directly onto the surface. And in this sense, he is a wonderful painter. There is no margin for error when he lays down paint in this way, and he has made no errors at all. There's not a single correction in any of the images on this painting. He knows exactly what he's going to do. He does it with great confidence, and he lays down this lovely liquid paint that just flows onto the surface and creates this perfect figure. One of the ways he's able to achieve this flow of paint is he uses a linseed oil paint that's mixed with a resin. Now, resin is a material, a natural material that exudes from trees, and examples of it would be copal or mastic or damar. Dali tended to use mostly mastic, but he was also a huge fan of amber. This painting is in such perfect condition that we are unable to take any samples to confirm exactly what he used in this painting, but I suspect it is an amber resin that he's used to mix in with his paint to create this very smooth flowing material that could just be laid down with a wisp of a brush hair.